Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop. And on this episode of the podcast, it is about a topic that is going to be near and dear to anybody who has done a multi-day race or has done one of the more recent 200-mile races that is popping up. It is how we can utilize sleep deprivation training, or let me rephrase that a little bit, how we can potentially utilize some type of sleep deprivation training in order to combat it during the race itself. This is an area that as a coach, I am quite miffed and befuddled with. I don't know how to actually prescribe sleep deprivation training or if it is beneficial for athletes. All too often, what I try to focus on when I'm working with athletes is the period of time in advance of an event to where they can bank sleep, and also the sleep strategies during the race itself. It's unknown to me, and it's unknown to a lot of the research community out there, that if any sort of sleep deprivation training is in fact beneficial for athletes, and if it is, when using a sleep deprivation training protocol, how deleterious or detrimental is it to the actual training process, which you need to go through anyway. And so on the podcast today, I have one of the researchers that can provide some answers to this very mysterious question, and Chiara Gattoni. Chiara is a researcher and a strength and conditioning coach. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Exercise and Sport Sciences from the University of Verona, a master's degree in sports science and training methodologies from the University of Verona, and a master's in sports and health sciences from the University of Exeter. She also has completed her PhD program at the School of Sports and Exercise Sciences at the University of Kent. And for those of you not in the know, the University of Kent right now is an absolutely baller exercise science program. They are producing some of the best research and some of the most intelligent minds in the field right now. I wanted to bring on Chiara to talk about a very specific case study that was recently published that is titled Sleep Deprivation Training to Reduce the Negative Effects of Sleep Loss on Endurance Performance. And although this is a single case study, and I want to take the time to emphasize that this is one person that went through a sleep deprivation training protocol, I do think that there is something to this. You longtime listeners of the podcast will know I don't mind bringing on people with novel solutions to problems onto the podcast if they can tell me what the physiological underpinnings are, and we caveat what we find in that type of research or in those types of novel solutions with the entire context of a training program. And what I found throughout the conversation that I had with Chiara is we could do just that. We could take apart what she found out in the single case study. We can take it for what it's worth. We can wrap it around the context of the entirety of the training program. And there seems to be some sort of physiological underpinning with the intervention that this single case study subject actually undertook. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, buckle up, drink some caffeine. Here is my conversation with Chiara Gattoni, all about if sleep deprivation strategies will actually work in an ultramarathon context. I appreciate you coming on all the way from London. Right out of the gate, why are you in London? Because that's not where you've been based out of recently. Is that correct?
Actually, well, I'm Italian, first off, but I've been living here in the UK for 9 years now. I used to work at the University of Kent. I did my PhD there, and then I stopped working there as a research assistant and first, and then research associate after, under the supervision of Professor Samuele Marcora. And then COVID came and a lot of things changed, and I found a new job here in London. So I'm working as a research fellow at UCL at the Department of Orthopedics and Musculoskeletal Science. But I'm still part of Sam Marcora's research group. So I'm working with him too. Yeah.
I think COVID kind of messed up everybody's quote unquote home base, because some people that were like planning on being, you know, wherever they were going to be for like 18 months, they ended up being there for 3 or 4 years. And it sounds like you kind of fell into that proverbial trap as well.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, indeed.
You have a really interesting educational background that I was not entirely familiar with until you sent it over to me. So the listeners can get to know you a little bit better. Can you just go over that background so that we can kind of appreciate the perspective, the different perspectives, more importantly, that you're coming from in terms of how you can look at not only athletic performance, but also human performance?
Yeah, sure. So I started my university journey in Italy. I did my bachelor degree and my first master degree in at the University of Verona. And then I worked for 3 years as a strength and conditioning coach for the under 23 football team in which is Chievo Verona. Now it doesn't exist anymore since last year. They had huge financial problems, but at that time they used to be in Serie A. So it was like a really good experience to me. And I always had in my mind to do a PhD. So after these 3 years, I decided to go abroad. And I did a second master first. I didn't feel really ready to be in the UK. You know, my English wasn't that good at that time, and I wanted to learn more. Also, the way you study in the US and in England is in the UK is slightly different from how we study in Italy. So I thought that doing a second master was a good idea for me to start in a new country. And I did a master in sport and health sciences at the University of Exeter. And then I applied for a PhD at the University of Kent, and actually I won the scholarship over there. I like the topic, that's why I applied for that, because I thought it was something different from all the other topics that I found around, because I focused on the effects of mental fatigue and sleep deprivation on endurance performance, and also we try to develop new forms of training to further improve performance. So I thought it was something new, and it was, and I love the topic. And then from there, I kept working with Sam Marcora. I don't know if you know him, but he's great. He's a great researcher. He's a professor. Yeah. He created this a psychobiological model. I strongly believe in that. So I kept working with him as a researcher. And now, you know, COVID came. He went back to Italy, and I decided to stay here. So I found a new job here in London. So it's a new adventure to me, something slightly different from what I do. But I try to keep working on my first topic too. Yeah.
And just like in the US and the UK, we tend to exploit our military personnel for a lot of the research that you do. They're one of the few subject groups that actually that makes good and readily available guinea pigs to study sleep deprivation and sleep restriction. So I can definitely appreciate that, because here in the US, much of that research comes out of our military branch, or at least originates in our military branch, and it seems to do the same in the UK.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a lot about sleep restriction and sleep deprivation and the impacts on performance. But since you've been researching this, I'm going to kind of ask you the $1 million question, like right out of the gate, and then we're going to get to why the answer to that question can be true or false. So in your observation and through your research, do you think that sleep deprivation training, irrespective of what the protocol can actually be or the intervention can actually be, do you think that can positively impact, and we'll stick to endurance because I know you have a broad background in this. Do you think that that can positively impact endurance performance when sleep deprivation is part of the performance context? So the event lasts over 24 hours or something like that.
Okay, that's an interesting question. If you ask my opinion, I would say yes, but of course, in science, you cannot only trust on opinions, so we need to be careful. I would never suggest sleep deprivation training before doing a proper randomized controlled trial. So as you rightly said, we first did a case study on a single subject, on a single athlete, and it seems to be well tolerated. It was well tolerated by this athlete, but of course we need to do more studies, and by a randomized control study, I mean like having two groups of athletes or military personnel, depending also where you find the fundings, from. If military personnel, if the, I don't know, MOD or other groups are interested, of course you need to test that type of subjects or population. But you need to have two groups and see whether the sleep deprivation training will add something to the already done physical type of training.
Yeah, sorry to like hit you with the loaded question right ahead of the gate, but I think that that's the initial hook for the listeners, because I think it's fairly well understood, and some people will contend that it's extremely well understood, that sleep deprivation or sleep restriction impacts performance in a myriad of different ways, whether we're talking about skill, like a shooting type of deal, like pistol shooting or even free throw shooting, which has been very well studied, and also endurance performance and also strength performance as well. And we can kind of like line all of those up. There's been a number of meta-analyses that have started to compare this. So it's very clear that it impacts performance to like different degrees. The intervention side of it is a whole different kettle of fish, because, to use an English phrase, since you're in the UK right now, because it's one thing to know that, yeah, of course, right, if you go without sleep for 48 hours, everything's going to be impacted, and we can estimate what the impact is. But how to circumvent that or how to prepare for it is a completely different question, and it's the one that the athletes in this audience is going to be more interested in. So we're going to explore that a little bit using the conduit of this case study that you have alluded to earlier. So you can add the caveats into this case study as you wish, because it's your work. But can you go and describe what the intervention was for this individual, and then what you found out after you went through that intervention?
Yeah, of course. So basically, what we did was to we thought, that we train our body and to generate some physiological adaptations and to therefore increase our performance, because that's the main final aim for an athlete. And we also recently tested brain endurance training, which is another type of training that we developed with what was initially developed by Marcora, and then we further developed it throughout these years. And we saw that by concurrently training body and brain, you can further improve your endurance performance. Okay, so we said since sleep deprivation is a state that anyway generates cognitive fatigue, it's a mental state, it generates a lot of effort, a lot of stress. Why can't we train it? Why can't we see like sleep deprivation as in this case as a positive thing to improve performance?
As an adaptable system, essentially. That's the way I've kind of viewed it. It's an adaptable system in your estimation, or why can't we view it as an adaptable system? Yeah,
exactly. And so we decided to basically try it on a single subject just to start. We did 6 weeks of sleep deprivation training, which consisted in not sleeping once per week, and while continuing training from a physical perspective, as the athlete would have normally done, So he kept doing the normal training sessions, and he added an extra night of sleep deprivation per week. And we tested him before and after the 6 weeks. We also created a new thing that, to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen in the literature, to be honest, because ultra endurance athletes are not so much tested, unfortunately. So we created a multi-day lab test in order to test him. And what we did, the multi-day test consisted in 5 days testing, in which in the morning the athlete had to run 2 hours on the treadmill at a constant pace, and at the same time we were alternating nights of sleep and sleep deprivation, sleep and sleep deprivation, and sleep again. So basically he had 2 nights of sleep deprivation in the middle. And of course, we were monitoring him. We tested him from an electrophysiological perspective. Also, we measured electroencephalography. We gave him several questionnaires in order to understand the mental, the workload perceived, both from a mental and physical perspective, the effort perceived throughout the training period. He was monitored with a GPS, with other several questionnaires to check his mood, to check if he, we were a bit worried. We wanted to check and to be sure that he didn't reach any sort of functional overreaching or overtraining, because we don't know how he could have reacted to 6 nights of sleep deprivation in 6 weeks. What we found out, interestingly, is that, first of all, as I mentioned before, he well tolerated the training, and he didn't reach any sort of overtraining or functional overreaching. And also, something really interesting is that throughout the 6 weeks, his sleepiness level, his subjective sleepiness level, decreased. So basically, we gave him a questionnaire in which we asked him his level of sleepiness, and at the end of the 6 weeks, it was much lower than when he started, basically.
Indicating that there is some sort of adaptation that was going on during that training period. Just to kind of like encapsulate that for the listeners.
Yeah.
The intervention, right, that you're using, or the intervention protocol that you're using, is a 6-week period where the athlete is foregoing sleep entirely for 1 night. It was on Sundays per week. And then he was maintaining, he or she, I don't know if the athlete was maintaining their normal training program throughout that entire time. And then you put them through kind of a testing process, which consisted of these 2-hour submaximal runs for several days in a row.
Yeah, it was a submaximal run. Who did it for 5 consecutive days, pre-training and post-training. It is average intensity, average run speed of this previous couple of races, let's say. And apart from that, before the running testing, we also measure his electrical activity at the brain level. So we measure electroencephalography, as I said. We did a test, who's a validated one, to measure objectively sleepiness level. So together with the questionnaires, we also had a more objective measure of sleepiness. And that's another interesting result because compared to the baseline, so compared to the first measurements done before the training program, the training period, after the training period, so after sleep deprivation training, the results of the electroencephalography indicated less levels of sleepiness, which is something interesting too. And another thing that we noticed and that we saw is that perception of effort during running slightly decreased after sleep deprivation training, together with effort perceived and mental demand perceived.
And the testing protocol that you mentioned is something that you kind of made up, right? They're running for 5 consecutive days of 2 hours, and there's 2 days of complete sleep deprivation. What was the timing of it? Is it like 2 and then 1 and then 2 and then 1, or like how did that get spaced out?
You mean the nights of sleep deprivation?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So basically, first night sleep, second night sleep deprivation, third night sleep, fourth night sleep deprivation, then sleep again.
Got it. So not a different, I mean, a lot of athletes out there that are listening to this are like, that's almost like a 200-mile race. I mean, the running periods are obviously very much shorter, but in terms of how you would sleep during a 200-mile race, for those of you not watching the YouTube video, you've got a good grin on your face because it's probably something that you were thinking about. But take me through if there was anything else behind coming up with that type of testing protocol, because as you mentioned, it's novel, right? It's something that you guys just essentially decided to do for this case study.
Yeah, well, regarding the test itself, it's totally novel, and we decided to try it because I checked in the literature, there's nothing on that. There are a few studies in which they did maybe 3 days of testing in a row, but it was not related to ultra endurance. It was not done to test ultra endurance performance. So we thought there's nothing in the literature. It would be really nice to have something, some material, some tools so that we can use with this type of population, with ultra endurance athletes. Of course, it needs to be validated, and we need to see if it's a reliable type of test before using it properly. This case study was a novel study. We tested several things, several new innovative things.
So let me try to encapsulate this a little bit for the audience, and you can add to it or correct me as I'm seeing it. The first takeaway when I looked at this was that the sleep deprivation intervention, so the training intervention, is what we would normally think about. You do strength training intervention, you can do an intensified, training intervention where you increase mileage or increase intensity or whatever. In this case, the intervention is the sleep deprivation and intervention of 6 weeks. First thing, that was well tolerated by the athlete, which is something we're always concerned about when we're actually coaching athletes, is the intervention going to be tolerated by the athlete and not be deleterious, right? You're avoiding the negative in that sense. And then the second thing, in terms of its actual impact there is some underlying physiological impact that you can measure via the test that you were putting the athlete through pre and post. Those two things are kind of what I take away from it. It's still a question of, is that ultimately going to impact or improve their performance, right? That's the thing that we're at the end of the day as coaches and athletes. But in terms of the intervention being well tolerated, at least by this person, you can check that box. In terms of seeing some sort of physiology that's underpinning a potential performance improvement, I can kind of check that box as well. Is that how you see it, or would you add any caveats to it?
Okay, yeah, is that how I see it? I would like to add a few things. First off, we have already received a lot of criticisms from from some colleagues of us from other research groups, apparently saying that this type of training is dangerous and ineffective. I understand the concerns that other people and athletes can have. And indeed, we're not suggesting to do that right now. We're just proposing something new. But I'm a bit, when I hear these such strong statements, I'm a bit shocked in a way. Maybe shocked is a strong word, but I don't understand how someone can say that it doesn't work, it's dangerous and ineffective if it's not been tested already.
Right.
So we need to be careful. And of course, I'm the first one to say the athletes not to use it at the moment, to wait for more proper studies, experiments, and let's see what happened. But from what we found out, and we spoke also with these athletes, it looks like that it's not a bad thing. And we tried when we decided how to create and to generate this type of training. We on purpose decide to use sleep deprivation once per week. Yeah. Because of course, we all know that sleep is really important for recovery in training, especially. And that not sleeping for many days can be really negative and deleterious for performance, but for many other things. So when people talk about chronic sleep deprivation, this is not the case. This is an intermittent sort of sleep deprivation. It's not a chronic one. And this is why we decided to use intermittent, because we believe that chronic is bad, and intermittent might be the best way to overcome the negative effects of sleep deprivation. So you have the time to recover from that night of sleep deprivation. At the same time, maybe adapt yourself to it.
And the way that I interpret that is that there's a dose-response relationship to anything you do. To exercise, to medicine, to whatever, and what you're intentionally, I'm emphasizing that word very deliberately, what you're intentionally deciding to do with the training intervention is to utilize enough sleep deprivation that you think is going to induce an adaptation, but not so much that is dangerous or deleterious. And I got to be honest with you, because I see some of this criticism that gets floated around, not as much as you do, obviously, but okay. I see some of it, and I kind of have a little bit of a skeptical eye on it as well. It lines up with what we know about what people can tolerate from a sleep deprivation or sleep restriction standpoint. Yeah, if you're doing 4 or 5 nights of sleep deprivation or severe sleep restriction in a row, yeah, sure, that's going to be a pretty heavy toll to pay. But as any new parent knows, or as anybody who has, had to take a transatlantic flight or had to stay up all night studying for exams or kind of whatever, you can usually tolerate 1 night, maybe 2 nights of heavy sleep restriction. And then you're going to have to apply some sort of recovery. So, so anyway, from my perspective, it meets the reasonability test for whatever that's worth.
Okay. No, but I understand. It's good to have doubts, Yeah. I'm the first one who I'm doubtful because I don't know how it works. But I also know that, for example, intermittent fasting is used too. And it doesn't make you die, okay, at the same time. It's true because we have received really strong statements, but for the same reason. Okay, chronic starvation leads to death, okay, as chronic sleep deprivation can lead to death, of course. But that's why we decided to go for the intermittent type of sleep deprivation. Yeah.
That's a good
don't know if
analogy. That's a good analogy that everybody can apply to. Okay, so let's go down the mechanistic rabbit hole a little bit, because you've got something that's novel, right? You've got a novel intervention. It's kind of meets the reasonability test. It's obviously a case study, which I think both of us will emphasize that it's a case study. It's on one person. We can't draw too many conclusions from it and things like that. When you look at this as a scientist from a mechanistic perspective, what's the adaptive, how can you describe the adaptive process? Because that's always what I struggle with sleep deprivation. Yeah, we can see the beginning and end points of what you can measure, but unlike muscle hypertrophy or some sort of aerobic development where we're increasing red cell mass or something like that, where we can pinpoint these like really narrow physiological mechanisms that are a result of a training intervention. This is an area that I'm just unfamiliar with, but it's not as robustly understood. So what do you think underpins the changes that you're clearly seeing in this case study, and that you can theorize that you can see in any other intervention? What physiological underpinnings can you actually see unfolding?
I think that the mechanism underneath performance from this perspective is related to the mechanisms related to perception of effort. We saw, for example, in our case study that perception of effort decreased post sleep deprivation training. And also the perception of effort and the mental demand perceived by the athletes himself were lower after the period of the training period. It's also been seen in some studies on acute sleep deprivation that it seems that performance is impaired when you're sleep deprived through perception of effort. So basically, perception of effort is higher, and therefore you perform much worse when you're sleep deprived. The mechanisms related to perception of effort involve certain specific areas of our brain, which are in particular the so-called anterior cingulate cortex, the premotor and motor areas of the cortex. What's happening that the higher the activity of these areas, the higher the perception of effort when you do exercise, for example, but also when you do a cognitive task. We're not talking only about physical activities. What's happening, in my perspective at least, what I think it happens when you do sleep deprivation training is that you adapt this, by doing this training, you adapt these areas, which in turn will lower their activity when you perform. Consequently, perception of effort is lower, and consequently, and finally, you tend to improve your performance. It's a complicated topic to explain in few words, but I hope I was clear.
Well, anytime we're talking about the brain, it's very difficult to kind of unwind, because there's so many intertwining things going on all at the same time. I'll leave it at that. Things going on at the same time, that as opposed to like muscular physiology or even cardiopulmonary physiology, it becomes this big mess where we have to lump everything into something like perception, right? As opposed to peeling it apart. But I mean, I can kind of tell you what I've experienced from a coaching perspective, having athletes in these situations where they have to go into a multi-day event, 3-4 days or whatever, and we're trying to figure out how to combat sleep deprivation. Is I've always viewed it through the lens that the advantage that you can get out of any type of sleep deprivation training is really rooted in understanding how you how you react and how you can perform in those conditions. And that's the best vocabulary that I could really use to to describe it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know where else to kind of like go from there in terms of making making a case for using an intervention like this, right? 6 weeks, you do 1 day of total sleep deprivation. And as coaches, we can kind of contrive it. Maybe it's 5 weeks, maybe it's 4 weeks, maybe it's 10 days. Every 10 days, you do the sleep deprivation training, or instead of an entire night, you do 2 hours of sleep a night. You know, there's a zillion ways to do it. But in terms of the value proposition to the athlete, I've always kind of viewed it through the lens of an experiential one, right? Not so much of a physical one, which we typically think about when we talk about endurance training or strength training interventions, where your muscles get bigger, your freaking lungs can transport, or your blood can transport more oxygen and things like that. So I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say with that is it lines up with just my anecdotal, this is why I would introduce this intervention in the first place.
Okay. That's good. But I think you're right, especially when we talk about ultra endurance, such long distances, long distance races, competitions. I think that we need to start talking about what's happening here too in the brain. It's not well studied. There are a few. I've seen there are a few studies in ultra endurance trials on, for example, cognitive performance during the race itself, which is important too, because apart from being physically prepared, you need to be also cognitively prepared. Sometimes you compete in very hard environments and you are sleep deprived at the same time, and you need to be vigilant for several days, and it's hard. So I think that looking for new things, new types of training that can help ultra endurance athletes is essential.
I want to kind of talk about what you want to study next, and then circle back to maybe some practical implementations for athletes that are looking at this. And I know the latter question is a very difficult one to answer, considering how like early stage some of the knowledge set that we're getting out of this research is. But maybe you can entertain me with some of your thoughts. If I were bringing you on as a consultant, what would you actually do type of questions? But you've already mentioned this, right? You've already mentioned a little bit of this. So you now have some initial case study, pilot data, and things like that. Where do you want to take it from here? Do you want to look at the intervention side, or do you want to look at different ways that you can test performance in a sleep deprived state? Like what do you think is more important to understand first in this like research chicken and egg game that you're ultimately going to have to play, because you can only do, so many things at once?
Okay, yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, as I said to you before, I'd like to do a proper randomized control study. So with two big, nice groups of athletes, possibly, and see the effects of sleep deprivation training on performance. But also, I would keep using electrophysiological measurements to have a proper insight, of what is happening at the brain level too.
That's your window, right? That's your window into the physiology, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think that the next step would be, I'd like at least to see what's happening at the brain level while you are exercising through functional magnetic resonance, for example, and see what's happening in those areas where perception of effort is involved. I'd like to find a way. At the moment, the technology doesn't require us to use functional magnetic resonance during proper exercise, because there would be too much noise.
Yeah.
But maybe starting with something less demanding, with smaller types of activities, of physical activities, it would be good too. Because I think that's the key. Perception of effort is the key in sports such as yours.
Yeah, it's a huge area, and this is probably unknown to you, but I spent a good chunk of my book actually using Sam's psychobiological model of fatigue as a construct for how to work on specifically the mental game of ultra running and how that impacts things. That's a kind of another topic. Do you think that when you expand the group, that you're going to start to see some of the prototypical individual variances start to get teased out, like we typically see in like more what I'll call like more traditional physiological research, whether an altitude intervention, right, is a good example of that, where we see people that have kind of different responses to different altitude training protocols. Do you think you're going to see something like that, or is it going to be more universal because it's centered around the human brain?
No, you're totally right. I think I'm going to see a lot of differences between individuals. And this is something that I forgot to mention, but I like to test too. Sleep, we start to see the sleep is, as many other things, genetically determined. So also the way you deal to sleep is genetically determined, it seems, at least. So for me, like not sleeping for an entire night, it can be like a really bad thing. I wouldn't be able to do anything the day after. For you,
I'm in your
example,
corner. I'm in your corner. I'm the exact same way.
Yeah, for someone else, it's not the same. So it would be good also to see how it works based on genetic traits, you know.
And
if there is any difference.
I know athletes that for whatever reason, they're just really good under sleep deprived condition with no rhyme or reason to it. It's not like they've trained it or whatever. They can just tolerate it for whatever reason. So practice would back up that sentiment that there is some sort of genetic component to it that I think is actually a fairly robust one, just because I see the discrepancy in people who can tolerate it and people who can't. And to date, it's not something that people have robustly trained.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Okay, so now I'm going to put you on the spot as a consultant, right? So you can take off your scientist hat and put on your consultant hat. So that gives you a little bit more like liberty to tell what you think versus what you've studied, right? Which I know a lot of scientists they're very reluctant to do. So there are athletes listening to this that are training for multi-day and 200-mile races, right? And they want to know if a sleep deprivation protocol is A, something that they should undertake, B, is effective, and then C, exactly what they should do. Now, I know those are kind of impossible questions to kind of generalize. But if you were consulting with athletes or even in a military kind of context where endurance performance is contingent upon how little they have to sleep and how fast they can locomote when they're actually awake, what would you advise that they do during the training process to try to ready themselves for that particular demand of the event?
Okay, so if I speak as a scientist, I wouldn't recommend to use sleep deprivation training yet, at least, because we don't know. We don't know at the moment the effects, if it's effective, really effective, or what. And I would suggest to sleep well. As a good process for recovery. Okay, but from a consultant perspective, and based on the fact that I've been an athlete too, I come from team sports, but I used to play, used to train a lot, and I know that athletes always want to try maybe something new or test themselves. And I already know that there are several ultra endurance athletes who do that because I've been to Tour de Jeanne,
Yep, I did Tour
Never
de
mind.
Jante a few years ago.
Oh,
Sleep was a
really?
big
Okay.
issue for me there. Oh, girl, we could talk about that for a while.
I believe so. I believe you. They already told me that some of them were already kind of training themselves not to sleep. Maybe not in a proper, organized way, but they were just trying randomly. So in that case, at that point, I would suggest them to try it in a more organized and well-planned way, instead of doing that randomly when they, or in 2 weeks' time, another night of sleep deprivation. But yeah, I cannot at the moment. I don't feel myself to suggest to use it right now.
It's tricky. I know I'm putting you on the spot with it because you have to wear two hats there. It's tricky. I'll give you an anecdote. Maybe you can ping off this anecdote a little bit, and you'll appreciate that. You'll appreciate this given your heritage. The Italians in particular were obsessed about doing their sleep deprivation, and in a very prototypical Italian fashion, you can appreciate this too, were completely haphazard in doing it. Like there was no pattern between anything. They would be like, 2 weeks ago I did, 3 nights without any sleep. And then 10 weeks before that, I did 1 night. It's very Italian. I just kind of like did it on a whim type of deal. But for whatever reason, the Italians, whenever I went over to Tour de Jante or just talked to them about it, that was their MO, is that they did do sleep deprivation training. They felt that it made a big impact. But to your point, it was so haphazard in nature, I couldn't really pin down any rhyme or reason for it.
Yeah, exactly. I heard the stories from Tour de Jante athletes too. So probably we spoke with the same people. Probably, I don't know. But if someone wants to try it, I would suggest though not to do that maybe in the week before the race. Just have some rest before the race and try it maybe a little bit separated, from the race itself.
What do you think I hate asking you this because it's going to be an I don't know piece, but based on the physiology and what you understand about how the brain is impacted, what do you think the legacy is of a training intervention like you did with this case study? And what I mean by that is this was over a very specific 6-week period. And you see some sort of adaptation that occurs, and you can understand the physiological underpinnings of that adaptation. How long does that last? And the reason I ask that is kind of to your point, don't do it in the last week of the race. We know that training interventions have a tail to them, right? I can introduce a high volume period of training, and that can last several weeks. I can introduce high intensity training, and that might just last several days or a couple of weeks, right? We can make that distinction between different types of training. Can you say anything to introducing a sleep deprivation intervention in terms of how long those effects might actually last, or is it just a big unknown for you?
This is another big question that we would like to test, but we don't know. We've thought about it. That's why I said it's better to give some time between sleep deprivation training and the race itself, just to be sure, because we don't know that yet. It can be that 1 week is enough, and you don't lose, the adaptations at the same time. 2 weeks, you're fully recovered, but adaptations tend to decrease. We don't know.
Yeah. I mean, when the deleterious pieces are removed, right? And that's when the sleep deprivation has essentially been restored. So if you have 8 hours of sleep deprivation or whatever the total is, once you can kind of continually restore that over the course of several days, the potential deleterious pieces, and you can see this in, skill sports and endurance sports alike, essentially get rectified. But it's a different question on the adaptation side of things, right? In one case, you're preventing the negative, and in the other case, you're trying to preserve the positive. That's the unknown piece, right? Is trying to preserve the positive. And this is part of the struggle that I have with introducing this type of intervention is going back to the dose response is I can't really pin down a dose, right? I can get it into an area which is kind of meets the reasonability test where it doesn't affect training too much, but I don't know how much that actually results in a positive adaptation, nor do I know, and I think you're getting to the answer to this question as well, kind of what the legacy is, like how long that adaptation would actually last before it goes back to baseline.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think that's the most difficult part to test as well, because it's difficult to say. It's going to be for sure something that we would like to test, maybe by doing the same type of sleep deprivation training, but of different duration, or starting before and completing it 2 weeks before the race, or 1 week before the race, or 3 weeks before, and see what's happening. Yeah.
Or a 4-week intervention versus a 6-week intervention, or even a 2-week intervention versus a 6-week intervention. Like those types of things are still kind of all unknown. It meets the reason. 6 weeks is pretty long, but it kind of meets the reasonability test, right? Of you're doing it frequently enough, I guess, to get some sort of perceived exertion adaptation, right, or physiological adaptation, and not so long that it becomes inconvenient or problematic.
Exactly.
Yeah. So more than one in less than 100 days.
Yeah.
Right? Because you did 6 weeks, 42 days. So somewhere in between there is the right dose.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Is there anything else that that you think that athletes can start to chip away at or do things to train for? I mean, we're looking at this from a binary, almost like a binary perspective, right? You're either sleeping or you're completely withdrawing all of the sleep per night. And there's a little bit of a hybrid in the middle, which is clinically referred to, or in the research referred to as sleep restriction versus sleep deprivation. Do you think that there's any room for that in terms of introducing an intervention that can be an advantage for an athlete that's going through something like this?
An intervention in between, you mean something
like sleeping for 2 hours a night instead of completely withdrawing all of the sleep?
Yeah, something like banking sleep. Is it correct, the word banking sleep? Yes.
Well, that would be that. I was going to get into that next, but yeah, that would be the opposite, where you're sleeping for more than the stereotypical 8 hours per night in order to have that built up for a sleep deprivation rate. But I'm talking about from a training intervention standpoint, instead of using complete sleep deprivation for one night, using sleep restriction where you're only sleeping for a couple of hours a night or 3 hours a night to induce the same effects that you're seeing from the sleep deprivation side. Do you think that there's room for that?
Yeah, definitely. We need to be careful though, because for sure, if you do sleep restriction instead of sleep deprivation, you may want to do it not once per week, but like more often during the week. And we don't know if it's if it works or not in terms of recovery.
Right. There's a bigger impact because you have to do it more frequently, is the counterbalance. Yeah,
because it's been seen that also, like if you do sleep restriction for a few days in a row, it's equivalent to not to sleep for one night, for example. So you need to be careful to quantify how many hours of sleep restriction for how long. But of course, it's something that it's interesting and can be investigated.
Well, I didn't want to mention this, but I'm going to go ahead since you opened the door up. I do think that from a pragmatic perspective, total sleep deprivation, using that as like a training tool, is it's a less problematic way to go about it, because if you're using sleep restriction, as you mentioned, typically you have to do a few days in a row, and at that point it's like, okay, then what is that, how much training are you taking off the table? And it seems that, and there's more literature as opposed to this case study that will back this up, that one night of complete sleep restriction isn't really that big of a deal in the total context of training, as long as you're not like maximizing your total training output that you're trying to do, or you're trying to achieve the last 1% of performance that you can maximally uptake. And what I mean by that is yeah, you wouldn't do that if you're going into the freaking Olympics. Like, nobody would tell you to stay up all night before an Olympic 10,000 meter final. But people take it like that whenever I mention these things. But if you're normally training and you have a reasonable background and you're not trying to squeak out every last little bit of training load or training volume, one night of complete sleep restriction, it's going to suck. It's not fun and it's not the best, but it's not like, you don't need to like upend every corner of the earth to kind of cover up for that. Like, people can tolerate it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's also been demonstrated. And sometimes also there are studies in which they didn't find any, actually any decrease in performance either. So for just one night of sleep deprivation. So that's my coaching rule of thumb. One night and you got to suck it up. 2 nights and then we'll make some course corrections after 2 nights, or if it's one night and then the previous nights or whatever, there's some sort of confounding factor, then I'll adjust the training. But one night total sleep deprivation, or what you sleep like crap for whatever reason, it's suck it up, buttercup. Anything beyond that, then we'll make some course corrections. And also, I'd like to stress the fact that since you mentioned it, but we are proposing this type of training for people who are competing also during nights, during multi-days events. So of course, I would never suggest this for a sprinter or for an 800-meter runner, Right. Just to be clear, we are doing this to find a way to increase performance in this type of athletes. It's part of the context of the event, right? I think that's a very important point. It's part of the context of the event. If it's not part of the context of the event, it's probably not ergogenic. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to let you off the hook. You've been a really good sport in dealing with a lot of these theoretical questions. I know how a lot of research scientists, they like to deal with it with what they know and what they've studied, and extrapolating outside of that becomes it's not in your MO. It's not in a lot of scientists' MO. So I appreciate you entertaining that piece. This is a really fascinating piece of research, and I think as more of these multi-day events like Tour de Géant, like the Cocodona 250, and these other 200-mile races that we're starting to see crop up around the world and in the US, as they become more popular, people are going to look at not only the sleep strategies that they need to deploy during the event, but how to properly prepare for them, because it is context of the event. And it's research like this that we're just starting to scratch the surface on, right? We're just starting to peel it back, that I think is extremely interesting and might change my perception of sleep deprivation training, which I honestly don't deploy a lot as a coach for all the reasons that we mentioned during the podcast. So I appreciate you entertaining a lot of the theoreticals here. Thank you. No problem. It was nice to talk to you. Before we go, go ahead. No, nice. It was a nice chat. I really enjoyed it. Me as well. Before you go, I'll have links to this, all these in the show notes. But where can people find out a little bit more about you or in the research group that you work for and some of the work that you're doing? Yeah, of course. Well, I'm pretty active on Twitter, which is at Chiara Gattoni, so my name and last name, and also have a ResearchGate profile in which I'm connected with my psychobiology fatigue lab with Sam Marcora. So you can find also all the other researchers who does research on that, not only on sleep, but also on mental fatigue, caffeine, and other things related to endurance performance. Fascinating work that you and your group is doing. And once again, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. All right, folks, there you have it.
there you go. Much thanks to Chiara for coming on the podcast today, and also the work that you do, and a little bit sticking your neck out on this one single case study. There's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to look at this and say, it's an N of 1, and we can't really learn it all that from it. And like I said during the intro, if we take this within the context that it is presented, we don't over exaggerate it. We look at if there are some physiological underpinnings to the actual intervention, which it looks like there actually are. And then we evaluate it alongside the entire context of what an athlete needs to do from a training programming standpoint. Then we can come up with some reasonable conclusions and solutions for athletes to actually deploy in training. So I had a lot of fun with this podcast. I hope you guys did too. If you liked it, feel free to share this podcast with your friends and training partners. That is how we get the word out. From the onset of this podcast, I have not taken on any sponsors or any sort of endorsers of any type. That is my commitment to the audience, to bring you the best content in a completely unadulterated fashion. You can help that out by sharing this podcast with your friends. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners out there. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.